You know, if you don't enjoy Gary Lewis albums, you don't have to leave a hateful comment. You don't have to paint me a picture. The handwriting's on the wall. It's very plain to see that you never loved him or me, and you never loved us at all, etc., etc. That ties in with today's video. Gary Lewis and the Playboys, you don't have to paint me a picture. The next album in our discussion series. So let's go ahead and jump in and talk about what makes this album unique. You might recall we talked about his last studio album, Hits Again, not so long ago, which despite pretty bland packaging and a very boring blurb on the back, had some pretty good moments on it, some great originals and a couple inspired covers, and of course a couple like A Well-Respected Man that didn't quite stick the landing. And of course our last video in my ongoing series was about Golden Greats. Golden Greats had a lot of those classics on it, kind of set the stage for all of the Gary Lewis hits collections and compilation albums to come. We got a cool gatefold with lots of Playboys featured on it, which is kind of unique, as most albums at this point did not actually feature any Playboys on it. And we got a personalized write-up from Snuff Garrett, the producer. And pretty solid hits package. This album, Golden Greats, went all the way to number 10 on the charts, their only top 10 LP, and sadly the last one to make the top 50 because the subject of today, You Don't Have to Paint Me a Picture, would only peak at number 79. Released in either very late 1966 or very early 1967, the booklet for the Threefer CD listed as February 67, Discogs listed as January, and Gary Lewis's website listed it as being late, presumably December 1966. I don't know for sure, I couldn't find a precise release date, but we'll go with late, very late 66 or early 67 for it. But anyway, released then with a couple successful singles. This album only peaked at number 79, the last top 100 LP that the group would have. Not the last to chart overall, but certainly the last to break that top 100. And definitely a step downwards from some of their previous successes. True, the group isn't known for their LPs, but certainly this one probably underperformed based on the standards that had been previously set. As always, I discuss the blurb or the write-up on the back. Usually it's too generous to call it liner notes. This one's not a whole lot better than the one from the aforementioned Hits Again. This one, also anonymous, also very short, and probably could have been done by one, PR intern in probably about 20 minutes. This one calls Gary Mr. Consistency, that all of his records, his singles, his albums, everything, they just turn to gold. They're just hits immediately, and how great and how wonderful it is, and so many other artists can't do that. And Gary, just everything he touches becomes a hit, and it's not great. It feels like a lot of PR and publicity nonsense. It's like, yeah, not a big fan. I wish they'd done something similar to what they'd done for Golden Greats. Have someone who was personally connected with the group come in, write something a little more sincere, a little more heartfelt, something that would have maybe given some insight into the group. But sadly, we don't really get that here. Pretty dull overall. One of the important real-world developments that affected this album and the next few to follow was that Gary Lewis was drafted in late 1966, and apparently on New Year's 1967 officially joined the U.S. Army. The booklet for the Threefer CD, which has a couple albums we'll be getting to in a little while here, talks about that Gary probably could have used his connections or his father's connections to sort of get out of Army service, but he thought, you know what, if Elvis did it, then I can do it. Elvis, of course, his being drafted inspired the musical Bye Bye Birdie. Gary Lewis, I don't think, inspired a musical like that, but that's okay. But anyway, he decided to serve, and I know even today he does veterans benefits and things like that, which is really nice. But that definitely confused Liberty Records and kind of impacted his career, because they realized, okay, for future albums, we either have to A, record when Gary's on leave, or B, dig in the vaults and see what's kind of laying around and use that for future albums. And it would ultimately be his service, going to Vietnam and all that kind of stuff, that would pretty much end his career as a major recording star, that sort of thing. Our new album here that we're talking about today, You Don't Have to Paint Me a Picture, relies very heavily on singles. I'm sure some of these songs were also ones they previously recorded that were just left in the can and dug out for this album, that kind of thing. But you can definitely see that with the idea, I should say, that, hey, these are recent singles, they're very successful, so let's make sure we put them all on here. Definitely kind of moving in that direction, I would say. Behind the production, we have both Snuff Garrett, as usual, as well as Leon Russell. Glenn Harden also pops up a little bit. We've talked about his work with the group previously, with albums like A Session With, primarily a songwriter, but this time he also did some production work too. A very good choice too. You know, he'd worked with the group, was familiar with them. I don't doubt that he was able to come up with some good ideas. It seems like Dave Pell and some of the sort of new figures we talked about with the previous albums, seems like they were kind of out of the picture by now. We were back to at least mostly normal. But it should be noted that despite this being a Gary Lewis and the Playboys album, yet again, no Playboys are pictured and none are listed in the production credits. We do get a complete list of their previous albums, just in case you missed one, but we don't see any of the main supporting musicians. Like I said before, my goal with these videos is not to go through and tell you who played on what, because that's a huge rabbit hole that I could probably make 50 videos on and still miss something or still get something wrong. We're going to focus mostly on the songs and the music, but keep in mind, no Playboys to be seen. So Gary Lewis is the de facto star. So let's jump into our song list. We start off with My Heart's Symphony, which had been a fairly successful charting single on there, peaking at number 13, not quite the top 10, but pretty close. Glenn Harden, of course, being involved in that. He'd had great success with them with the previous song, Count Me In. We talked about that before. Yes, he does get the writing credit too. There's the LP for you. Pretty good stuff there. So My Heart's Symphony is interesting. First of all, some of the other releases on compilations and I should say sets to come would feature sessions in addition, such as the release on this Greatest Hits package. Have a little bit of a count in, talking about the harpsichord player, that kind of thing, adding a little bit extra studio context to it. The actual album doesn't have those, it jumps straight into the song, My Heart's Symphony. It was their first major single to not break the top 10, but again, 13, certainly not a bad showing. You know, You Don't Have to Paint Me a Picture isn't really marketed as a concept album. It's kind of a collection of stuff. Indeed, the booklet for the CD says it's kind of mixed up and, you know, a mismatch of different things kind of pieced together. But actually, I would say this is sort of their breakup album. And My Heart's Symphony works pretty well. It's a peppy song, but also very melancholy too, and ultimately about how you really love somebody, you don't get them in the end, and by the end your heart can't play a symphony because your heart is gone, that sort of thing. All the love has just been stomped out of you. So interesting stuff there. It's been covered by other groups, like the Four Lads did this very, you know, fancy operatic sort of cover, which is a lot more intricate than what Gary does, but Gary's works with all the sincerity and all of just the earnestness to it. I think his version's still better. A good album opener, a good single, kind of depressing but upbeat enough maybe you wouldn't notice it, you know, off the bat, or it wouldn't, you know, kind of ruin the rest of the album for you. Next up, a cover of Robert Parker, we have Barefootin'. You might notice the person who had this LP before me liked to write on it, or people I should say. A few different styles of handwriting there. Anyway, Barefootin' was Robert Parker's only big success. Barefootin'. And Gary Lewis follows it pretty closely. It's kind of a copycat cover. Doesn't really do a whole lot with it. Not quite as wild as Parker's original, more of a pop version. It's a good tune for him though. He sounds good singing it. I get why it's here. I'm okay with that. We have Sloop John B, and we finally get to, I think, the only time the Playboys ever directly covered the Beach Boys with Sloop John B. Now, Sloop John B, of course, was not done by the Beach Boys originally. The song itself dates back at least to the 1910s, if not earlier. But the Beach Boys have probably the most famous cover, or should I say adaptation, of the song. Their version, of course, was influenced by the Kingston Trio's cover of it, Barry McGuire's version, which kind of plays it for laughs, but does have some similar ideas and sort of musical orchestrations that the Beach Boys would run with. Gary's version, here called Down on the Sloop John B., follows the Beach Boys one pretty closely, except it isn't anywhere near as advanced. He doesn't attempt the sort of a cappella piece the Beach Boys have. We don't have all the huge, backing instrumentation that the Beach Boys version that was later used on Pet Sounds would have. Gary's is a much simpler cover, but uses a lot of the same ideas. Sloop John B famously starts with a flute, doo, 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 and Gary definitely copies that. Can't tell that he uses a flute per se, but same kind of idea there. I guess you're looking for kind of a simple, streamlined version of the song, but yet still keeping kind of some of the Beach Boys vibes. This would be the one to listen to. Interestingly, Down on the Sloop John B was considered for a single to be back with Ice Melts in the Sun. Oops, got my Sloop John B, sorry about that. To be back with Ice Melts in the Sun, which we will get to later when we discuss some other albums, like More Golden Greats, that sort of thing. But that was ultimately abandoned. So Down on the Sloop John B was put back in the can in terms of a single release, and most people would have heard it for the first time here. Should also add that Gary doesn't do a lot of the lyrical changes the Beach Boys do with their version. This is the worst trip I've ever been on. Excuse me, not never. I've ever been on. Like, that line isn't in his version. That sort of thing. He kind of keeps it closer to the traditional lyrics, closer to something like the Kingston Trio would have done. Next up is a song we have talked about already, which is kind of unusual. You might remember with the Golden Greats album, I said that most hits packages feature something unusual or something previously unreleased or available elsewhere, or not available elsewhere, I should say, to kind of incentivize fans to buy it. With Golden Greats, it was the song Tina. Tina had not yet been released on an LP. It was available as a B-side to the My Heart Symphony 45, but it wasn't available elsewhere until this release. Now we have it on an actual studio album of new material. We have it included here. I talked about Tina some in that Golden Greats video. It's a good song. The lyrics are a little weird, a slave to your kisses, and some of these bizarre lines. But it's a very pretty song. I think it does fit the vibe of being kind of melancholy. I think it works on this album pretty well. Again, someone who bought the Golden Greats LP just to have that song, just to have this one come out and they could buy it again, probably weren't too happy about that. It's weird to have your sort of quirky or rare song on your greatest hits package be your newest single, because something like this could happen pretty easily. I could see that souring a few buyers, but nonetheless, who knows? I think it fits here. It's a nice song. Tina's very pretty. Then we have a String Along by the songwriting team of Bobby Doyle and Jimmy Duncan. Fabian, I believe, had done the original version of String Along back in about 1960. Ricky Nelson had also done a cover. It was certainly one of those songs that the teen idols of the day would have performed. Gary takes it, makes it a little more modern, a little more up-tempo, a little bit more, I guess, presentable to the pop audiences of the mid-60s rather than the early ones. Now, although he speeds it up a little bit, I don't think it quite does enough with the song to make it really stand out. And he kind of definitely is still trying to follow some of those concepts that have been laid down by Fabian and Ricky Nelson. So, an interesting choice here. Sometimes when they cover an older tune, like we talked about Rubber Ball not too long ago, they change it up some. This one's enough to make it feel more modern, but not really enough to do anything too crazy with it. One thing they do is kind of eliminate all the backing vocals, sort of the choir voices. That stuff's all gone, so they probably saw those as holdovers from the 50s. So, fun little pop cover, but nothing too groundbreaking. And we end our first side with the title song, You Don't Have to Paint Me a Picture. I'll show you the record here. In most cases, it's stylized as You Don't Have to Paint Me a Picture, but I guess in theory, you could just call it Paint Me a Picture. I don't know that anyone does that. But a really good song there. Leon Russell, Snuff Garrett, and Mr. Tillison all get their credits there for writing it. Also fits in kind of with the breakup vibe of the song, you know, or I should say of the album, excuse me, of the album, because it does a little bit of, it's peppy and it's fun, but the lyrics are kind of melancholy and kind of sad and deal with a relationship that's doomed to fail, that sort of thing. Interesting stuff. This single went all the way to number 15. So it was at least moderately successful for the group. I like that. So, good stuff there. So we put our title single kind of in the middle of the album. It works really well. Again, one of those ones that I can't talk too much about because most of what's been described about it has already been said. So let's go ahead and flip the record over. We'll take a look at the B-side. We have what I think is the group's most underrated song, Where Will the Words Come From? A very sad breakup song. And you can see it gets pretty prominent listing up here too. Where Will the Words Come From? Peaked about number 21 on the chart, so one of their first singles, or maybe the first single they did to not break the top 20. But Where Will the Words Come From is a very sad song. You want to break up with someone, you don't love them anymore, but you can't bring yourself to say it. And I think it's oddly modern and weirdly prescient for a lot of couples today. Sometimes we stay in relationships longer than we should with people we don't really care about just because we don't have the heart to say what really needs to be said. It's a very beautiful song, and we actually can get some of a live version on the new twofer that came out last winter, December 2024. In the live hits medley, Gary markets this as the newest song the group did and does an excerpt of it with the band. It sounds really good live. Like I said, this, I'm always surprised, isn't more highly regarded amongst Gary Lewis and the Playboys fans. Where Will the Words Come From? Very beautiful song, influenced, as the booklet says, by the work of Burt Bacharach and Hal David, people like that, trying for a more mature sound. You know, Gary Lewis and the Playmen instead of the Playboys, I guess. The B-side, oddly, you would think they could go back and maybe take Sloop John B and put that on there so they could use it for something, but no, instead they opted to use a much older song. In fact, one from their first LP, called May the Best Man Win, sometimes just called The Best Man. And we talked about this before. It's sort of a pseudo spoken word track. It is still sung, but it could very easily have been redone as a spoken word bit, all about, you know, your best friend and you are competing for a girl and she opts to marry him instead of you, so you have to be the best man and, you know, sit there and watch them be married. And it is kind of melancholy and stuff. I get that, and it has a weird vibe, has this kind of psychedelic take on the Wedding March, which is really weird. But Wikipedia actually theorizes that this was to advertise the upcoming release from Sunset Records, Gary Lewis and the Playboys. There was a compilation that was to come out pretty soon. Sunset was Liberty's budget label, and with the Playboys' popularity kind of starting to wane, you know, with Gary overseas in the Army, they couldn't do any touring or any like personal publicity kind of stuff. So it makes sense that they would go for a compilation of classics that hadn't been featured on that previous Greatest Hits package, and May the Best Man Win is indeed featured here. In fact, on the front of the cover it gets listed first, so it must be something they thought people would be interested in, and so maybe this has some connection with that song in terms of why it was picked to be its B-side. I don't know. So Where Will the Words Come From? The A-side, May the Best Man Win the B-side. The singles collection CD actually lists these two together, even though May the Best Man Win is much older. So I don't know, kind of an interesting choice there. We follow that up with You Come On Like a Dream, Peaches and Cream, and Lips Like Strawberry Wine. A song that some people refuse to listen to on the grounds that it's creepy. You're 16, you're beautiful, and you're mine. You're 16, of course, was done by the late, great Johnny Burnett. We talked about some of their versions of Johnny Burnett songs before. Notably, they did probably Burnett's most famous one. If I can find it, I'll show it to you. There it is. They did his version of, Dreamin'. not so long ago. That was on the Everybody Loves a Clown LP. So here they're back again. You know, one thing I gotta say about You're 16, You're Beautiful in Your Mind is that Gary Lewis is able to do it. His voice sounds young enough, it's not creepy. Ringo Starr had a very successful cover with it when he was in his 30s, and a lot of people criticize it now for being really creepy and weird, and it kind of is. Even though Gary was much older than 16, his voice sounds young. He's kind of able to sell it. I actually think he does a better job than Burnett does with the original. I don't know, maybe that's just me. But interesting there to think about. Some people won't listen to it, I totally get that. It is kind of dated and stuff like that. The arrangement's very similar, probably because producer Snuff Garrett actually worked on both. Burnett's original from 1960, I should say Johnny Burdett, excuse me, not Jimmy. Burnett's original, and then also this version. And he had done production work on several covers that Gary Lewis and the Playboys had done. He also worked on the originals. Special thanks to Tall Paul in Kentucky for pointing out that he'd done the original Rubber Ball as well, allowing him to have some insight into how Gary should tackle it, you know, with the Playboys and make his version. Followed by what I think is an original for this album by Sonny Curtis, who we talked about several times on this channel before. We have When Summer Is Gone. I'll see you in September when summer is gone. This one must have been a song that Curtis had written that was just kind of laying around, so they gave it to Gary. He does a really nice job on it. Again, it's one of those ones that it's really nice to listen to, but it's also kind of sad. You know, your love is going away for the summer. You won't see her till the school year starts. She might be tempted by another man. You don't want that to happen, that sort of thing. But Gary sells it really well. I like his version. I'm kind of surprised because I don't think it was ever used as a B-side or anything like that, which is a shame because it would have been quite good. There are other instances too where the Playboys have taken songs that haven't been done by other artists, just kind of ones Liberty had laying around, and done their versions of them. You can check out the previous videos for more info on that, but you know, it's nice that it's here. I think it's a good inclusion. I think it kind of fits with that upbeat but also kind of sad vibe the rest of it's going for. After that we have Linda Lou. Linda Lou was by Ray Sharp back in 1959, and his version has been covered many times. The Rolling Stones did a very famous kind of psychedelic avant-garde cover. Gary tries to copy Ray Sharp, but he doesn't really have the voice for it, I don't think. So instead of coming off as this sort of soulful, jazzy, you know, upbeat kind of thing, his is more like a simple pop, easy listening bit. We've talked about that with previous songs the group has done too. Just not the best choice for them, but not bad. But Gary can't quite sell the frenetic vocals of it as well. His version definitely sounds a lot more sedate than it probably should. But I'm glad he tried it though. It's not a bad choice for him, just not quite his style. Then we come to what is maybe the weirdest song the Playboys ever did, at least in some capacity. I mentioned before that May the Best Man Win is sort of a spoken word track. Not really, but kind of. And we've talked about spoken word stuff with them before, notably with Time Stands Still, which was a B-side single, popped up on Everybody Loves a Clown, where Gary has this extended spoken word bit where he spoofs his father and does kind of a clownish thing. But here, Looking for the Stars is pretty much completely spoken word. There is an instrumental backing, but not really much is done with it. Gary's walking around Hollywood looking to meet some famous people. He bumps into imitators of John Wayne, Edgar Buchanan as Uncle Joe from Petticoat Junction, Jack Benny, and Walter Brennan, all of whom talk about where he could go to find stars and how, or maybe how they're too busy to help him find stars, that kind of stuff. And it's this kind of comedy skit, and he wakes up at the end, the other Playboys tell him to go on stage, and the crowd goes crazy. It's such a weird bit. Imagine if the Beach Boys had taken Bull Session with Big Daddy, or something like that, and used it as a B-side. Probably wouldn't have gone over too well. And that's the same vibe here, because actually the B-side to You Don't Have to Paint Me a Picture was Looking for the Stars. It's so bizarre. We have 5 credited writers, Gary being one of them. I don't know if these writers were also maybe the ones doing the voice imitations for the famous actors. Kind of hard to say. Should be worth noting too that if you do a song that's very topical, the problem with it is it's going to age really badly as time goes on. So I could see my students today not quite knowing who these people were supposed to be. They might recognize John Wayne, but like they're not going to know who Edgar Buchanan as Uncle Joe is supposed to be. So I don't know. It's a weird one. It's a weird one. It does kind of fit, I guess. It doesn't really disrupt the flow of the album as much as I've maybe made it sound like, but definitely a weird choice, and just kind of a weird track in general for him to do one that's not really like a singing track and more of just like a comedy novelty bit. I don't know, not something we really associate with the group. And lastly, Wild Thing, You Make My Heart Sing. A group called the Wild Ones had done a song called Wild Thing in the mid-60s. It didn't really catch on. I will say their version is very sexualized. It's pretty obvious what they're singing about. The Trogs, indeed, or the Trogs, I should say. Excuse me. The Trogs had the most famous version of it, very successful cover of it, and Gary Lewis tries to copy their version of Wild Thing. And the problem is that Gary can't seem to make up his mind if he really wants to rock out with it, or if he just wants to kind of do a lighter, poppier version. We talked about songs like All Day and All of the Night, where he kind of, sorta commits to it, but not really, and ends up doing kind of this lighter, sillier version. I don't know. Doesn't quite stick the landing for me. Wild Thing, of course, is a very aggressive song, an early progenitor to metal and punk and other really heavy rock genres, I guess I should say. So it's weird that Gary would kind of try that, but not really commit to it, and the instrumental's much lighter as well. So we kind of get something of a light poppy cover that tries occasionally to be a rocker, and it just doesn't quite fit. I don't think Gary was the best choice. Of course, lots of versions of Wild Thing have been recorded. The Trogs even did a version with Oliver Reed. I don't know if the Sam Kinison cover was done with their blessing or not, but a weird choice to end the album on, and also a weird choice for the group in general. Not quite sure how I feel about that one. Generally speaking, You Don't Have to Paint Me a Picture isn't well discussed in Gary Lewis and the Playboys sort of circles. Other people who have reviewed it online are pretty dismissive of it. It's a hodgepodge. The CD booklet notes that it's kind of mixed up and it doesn't really have a theme, and it's pieces and parts of things. As they knew Gary was going to be in the service, they were just kind of stitching songs together to make an album, that kind of thing. But I actually think You Don't Have to Paint Me a Picture works pretty well, and I think is much more organized than many give it credit for. It's one I don't listen to very much, but after researching for this video, I think I have to listen to much, much more. We have a lot of songs that are kind of melancholy, but also upbeat. I like that. It's kind of almost a breakup album in a way. I like that too. Yeah, there are a few real oddballs like Looking for the Stars, but I was surprised at how cohesive it felt, because I hadn't really noticed it till I sat down and really listened. So in some ways this might be the most underrated album that the group has done. So definitely some fun stuff there. Of course, we have another one that's often said to be underrated coming up very soon. And it'll be New Directions. That'll be our next Gary Lewis video. Check out the gigantic Gary face on it. We'll get to all that when we get there. And of course we'll have this Sunset compilation, which I cannot find a precise release date for, but I'm sure I'll be able to find it somewhere here. We'll have that coming up pretty soon too. But join me next time for my April Fool's video. Hope to see you for more music and movie reviews. Please like and subscribe if you haven't. I hope to see you next time. So long, my friends.